and we talked about how economic sanctions need to be teamed up with other things, right? The threat of military intervention, right, in order for it um, to be effective, right? Okay, so this is probably a good article to just look at and to basically revive your sort of like spur your uh, memory about what we had talked about earlier this semester. Okay. Taiwan is protesting South Korea's retraction of an invitation to its minister. It had actually invited one of its ministers to a conference, but rescinded it over cross-strait issues. As we know, right, this South Korea does need to balance, right, its relationships between China and Taiwan. Part of the reason is because it needs Beijing's help, right, in its relationships with North Korea, right. So that's part of the reason why you probably see a number of countries in the region trying to figure out what's the best way to balance, right, between two competing or two states that are in direct conflict with each other. Yeah, so you will probably see that more and more coming up the next year, 2022, especially with the US taking a renewed what do you call it? Renewed uh, um, interest in the Indo-Pacific, yeah, especially because of China. All right, and then we have a report, of course, of China, launching a campaign, a soft power campaign to try to um, boost its soft power on the internet. Yeah. So last week we also talked about that, about how they were actually using social influencers, right, to international social influencers who are um, um, a little bit partial to it to try to shape um, global perception, right? Global perception of Beijing itself. Yeah. So apparently, I mean, of course, New York Times was looking at basically how China is using bot networks, automatic posts, and online personas to try to um, provide a to counteract all the negative opinions about it online. Yeah. And it's basically actively shaping global opinion. Okay, and yeah, this week is full of China and Russia again. Yeah, so we have got foreign diplomats in China helping Lithuania to evacuate its staff from China. As you know, Lithuania and China have got involved in a diplomatic spat, right? And Lithuania is basically standing up to China, right? Because China is actually upset that it has allowed Taiwan to set up a de facto embassy in Lithuania, and but of course Lithuania is not standing down, and so there's been tensions between the two countries. They've downgraded their diplomatic ties, um, and that's also a sticking point, right, with China's trade relationships with the EU. Right, it's coming at a point where at the point where China was trying um, to hammer out a trade agreement with the EU. So this is going to be holding that back quite a bit. You know? Okay. Overnight, UNSC has actually adopted a resolution, right, to provide aid to Afghanistan, um, and basically it is to help to facilitate humanitarian aid because Afghanistan, the situation there is quite dire, and they were basically trying to figure out how to word the resolution because the initial resolution was voted down by Russia and China because they didn't want to support a resolution that's on a case-by-case basis. And so, yeah, they managed to get the two on board with the new resolution, which was unanimously adopted, that was proposed by the US. So I have put up two articles, right? Basically, this one that said that the sanction had passed. I mean, not sanction had passed. The resolution had passed, and the other one was looking at a report on Russia and China um, actually blocking, right, the sanctions. This was basically the day before. Yeah. So this article that was by AFP, reproduced in the Straits Times, basically explains why China and Russia blocked the draft resolution, the US-backed draft resolution to the UNSC. Basically, a diplomat said that the China and Russia wanted the deletion of a paragraph of the resolution allowing the sanctions committee responsible for Afghanistan to provide exemptions from the freezing of assets if it considers that such a waiver is necessary to facilitate further assistance to Afghanistan. So basically what China and Russia was opposed to was that the fact that they were opposed in principle to the fact that the sanctions were a a case by case exemption mechanism. Yeah, so that's part of the reason why they opposed it in the first place. But apparently, I mean the subsequent draft that after incorporating that objection, the UNSC passed the resolution unanimously. Okay, so now we're looking at Ukraine, Russia, and NATO. As you know, nothing has really moved. Yeah, and Russia is getting increasingly upset and uh, you know, wanting a resolution. All right, I mean, basically saying that it doesn't have any room to retreat, and it is basically stating that it's being forced into a tough response. Right? So they are not shy of using military. So this is probably the closest that Europe is coming to possibly an um, all-out military um, action. Yeah, in Europe itself against Russia. So basically, yeah, Ukraine is also um, getting impatient, right, and frustrated by the lack of what it sees as the NATO's reluctance to speed up its membership. Of course, that's also the sticking point, right, with Russia, because Russia wants NATO to basically assure that, give its assurance that it is never going to grant NATO membership to Ukraine, right? So yeah, so that's basically a red line for Moscow. So it's things are sort of like heightening to a feverish pitch. So we'll see what happens in the new year, right? Hopefully nothing happens between now and the new year, right? But Russia definitely is not backing down. Okay, and then we have the Iran nuclear deals talks, right? Basically, the West is becoming increasingly pessimistic, whereas Iran, on the other hand, is becoming more upbeat about the nuclear talks, right? So the European diplomats that are in talks with Iran um, are not, they feel that basically they are actually reaching the end of the road where the nuclear talks are, but um, Tehran believes that they are making progress because some of the texts some of the documents that they have discussed in recent days actually takes into account Iran's position. So they say that gives them the the possibility that they can continue future discussions. So interestingly, right, two opposing viewpoints. Okay, any questions or any other articles that you guys might have found over the week or saw over the week that you might want to put into the pile? Okay, so none from you. All right, let's take a look at what we are supposed to cover for today then. Let's see. All right, let's do a quick recap. Yeah. Um, I think you should remember, right, what we talked about last week. We actually talked about the relationship between the media, the state, and public opinion, right? So we said that basically you normally, generally, right, the public's attention on foreign policy issues is actually relatively fragmented. They don't always pay attention, right? And of course, part of the reason also is because of the way the media reports, right, news as well, right? They will focus their attention on certain news items that seem to be on their agenda, but once it's no longer there's no new developments, the attention on those issues fade away, right? So that's part of the reason why the public's attention is also relatively fragmented. And because the public's attention is relatively fragmented, it is relatively easy to manipulate public opinion. Yeah, because you will realize that, given that Rosenau's hierarchy, right, uh, uh, of different segments that are interested in foreign policy issues and their attention span on news, you find that the elites are the ones with the information advantage, right, over the public because they have access to sensitive information. They have access to foreign policy information that is probably kept out of sight from the public, right? So they would have the information advantage over the public in the short term, but that informational gap between the elites and the public starts to narrow over the longer term as more information becomes available, as more articles are being written, as the media starts to dig further and starts to investigate or look for information and get different experts' opinions on a story, right? It becomes then the public becomes more informed about all the different issues um, that link back to a foreign policy situation, for example. Yeah. So the extent to which the elites are able to um, shape public opinion really depends on the level of partisanship over foreign policy issues. So if, let's say, you have broad consensus on what how we should act, right? How we should behave towards a certain state, right? Right, and it is actually broadly, supportive. There's broad consensus across different political parties, across the different political platform ideologies, right? You'll find that then there will be, there will be this rally around the flag phenomenon that can result. The public would be, rallied around what the elites want, right? They'll be supportive of what the elites are saying as well, right? But when the political elites, right, publicly disagree, right? And they start to, have debates on, there is a back and forth debate on media, etc., right? And which is often the case in, a place like the US. You see it on CNN, you see it on MSNBC or CBS, etc. You find that, the media's ability to influence public opinion is increased, right? Because it really, the media can shape the public's understanding of the news, right, in a particular way, possibly in a biased way as well, by the way, through the way they present issues, through the experts they bring on to comment on the issues, through the, different debate forums, right, that they have on the, media platforms. Then we also talked about the CNN effect, right? Where, we noticed there was that theory that this, the CNN effect is that, as long as if the media covers something, right, and because of the immediacy of the reports that, that is, distributed, right, not just to the elites but also to the ordinary folks, ordinary citizens, right? Um, the elites are basically forced to do something about the reports, and so the media basically leads foreign policy, right? It forces the hands of the elites, the political elites, to do something about a foreign policy issue, for if, that they had highlighted in their reports. Yeah, but if you look at what Baum and Porter said, they basically said that the CNN effect was really a temporary phenomenon, and it only occurred during that particular period in time. Usually, it's due to, it was due to the coincidental confluence of new technology and a lack of geopolitical threat, especially to the US at the point in time in the late 1990s. Because remember that 1990s, that was with the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? The US was basically the prime hegemonic power, right, in the international space, right? So it didn't have any geopolitical threat, any um, uh, any any particular state that would pose a real geopolitical threat to it. So that's when you find that, CNN effect became a you know, a particular effect that was seen in the 1990s, right? Because of the new technology that was available that allowed the media to instantaneously, right, broadcast or distribute um, its news, the news to the ordinary citizens. But since then, the political and military elite have actually found ways to censor as well as regulate and to redirect the media's access to information. Yeah, and they have done that through staged events like what we call embedded journalism, where journalists are actually embedded with the military to go into a war-torn country or to the front lines, right? And they are basically shown what they are, the Pentagon, the military uh, decides what to show them and what they can report on, and so they basically led into the uh, given access to the front lines through the military, and they do not do it independently of the military. So as a result, military can actually dictate, right, the kinds of stories that they come up with, that they report on, and which would be, generally supportive of the military's activities in the area. Yeah. Okay. I had this video. I forgot to insert this earlier in the earlier topic, but I thought it was still something that would be relevant for us to take a look at. Yeah. So if you can just take a look at, watch this video and think about what this Stephen Walt says, right, about how American foreign policy, right, how it projects itself has actually inspired resistance, insurgency, and terrorism.
Well, the United States really, since the end of the Cold War, has launched a project to try and spread what you might call a liberal world order in many parts of the world. We started the 1990s thinking that democracy, free markets, and lots of other good things were spreading almost automatically, but the Clinton administration decided to give it a shove with NATO expansion, with a number of other programs designed to spread democracy in various places. And then, of course, the Bush administration took it to the next level with the invasion of Iraq. But this didn't stop under the Obama administration, which, of course, tried to topple Muammar Gaddafi as well. So this is a bipartisan product of Democratic liberal internationalists and Republican neoconservatives. And the basic idea is to try and spread something like the American system in as many places around the world as we could. The problem is this doesn't work very well. It failed in Iraq, it's failing in Afghanistan, it failed in Yemen, it failed in Libya. And it's not looking particularly good in places like Hungary and Poland, which are starting to show certain illiberal signs. Moreover, the optimism people once had about Russia becoming a member of the democratic family of nations, I think, have been disappointed as well. Now, why does this fail? Well, the first problem, of course, is that spreading democracy into other countries inevitably means regime change. You've got to get rid of the existing government and replace it with something new. But of course, when you take apart an existing order, you can't be sure what the new order's going to look like. And you're going to create a lot of angry losers, people who are resentful at their loss of power and status. And in some places, like Iraq or Libya, they're able to take up arms to resist this effort. So simultaneously you create an incentive for resistance, an incentive for insurgency, and by destroying the existing order, you also create an open space where terrorists and other extremists can flourish. So the big problem first is you're beginning by tearing apart a new order without knowing how to replace it. And that really is the second problem. We don't know how to create viable democracies in other countries, and especially in countries that have never been democratic before, where there are deep ethnic divisions, where they're not necessarily very prosperous. And we ought to remind ourselves that it took 200 years or more for democracy to emerge in the West. That was a violent and contentious process. And to believe, as we did in, say, 2003, that we could invade Iraq and create a shiny new pro-American democracy in 5 or 10 years was positively delusional. And I think you see this in one final way. When the United States ends up owning one of these countries, it has to occupy it, it has to try and keep order, but it doesn't know enough about the inner workings of that society, which people are reliable, which people can be trusted, to do the kind of social engineering that creating a new nation or creating a new system of government would entail. So recently in Afghanistan, a local American commander had to apologize for issuing a propaganda leaflet which included the flag of the Taliban, some Quranic verses, and an image of a dog. Dogs are regarded in parts of the Islamic world as unclean, and to associate that with the Quran, of course, was deeply offensive to many of the Muslims for whom it was intended. Now, I mention this only because the United States has been in Afghanistan for 16 years, and we still haven't fully figured out how to operate in that society in order to have sort of reliable, positive effects. The bottom line here is this well-intentioned effort to spread American values, American institutions into many different corners of the world has been an almost complete failure. And if the United States wants to promote its values, it ought to devote much more effort to creating an exemplary democracy here in the United States so that other countries will look at the United States, say, I'd like to have something like that, and then build their version of it. It's something that we can do leading by example, but not leading with the military edge. Two more good illustrations of our inability to do nation building in many parts of the world are the failed effort to create a new democracy in Libya. There's an uprising in Libya as a consequence of the Arab Spring, and the United States and several of its democratic allies, especially France and Britain, decide to intervene on behalf of the rebel forces. Now, this was originally intended, or so we said, as a purely humanitarian act to prevent Muammar Gaddafi, who was at that point still in power, from conducting some kind of mass killing of the rebels. But we quickly expanded beyond that and gave help to the rebels in the form of air power, such that they eventually succeeded. But of course, once the Gaddafi regime, which was by all accounts a horrific, inefficient despotism, but once it was gone, there was no order left. And instead of a stable, effective democracy, what you had instead was the emergence of warlords, factions, militants, and essentially a failed state. It also involved Libya's very considerable arms arsenal getting spread out and scattered to a variety of other extremist groups in other places, including Syria. So the bottom line here is a well-intentioned effort to promote human rights and spread democracy ends up creating a failed state instead. And that is essentially the same story one could tell in a place like Yemen, where the United States has repeatedly intervened to try and promote more democratic outcomes, and where we now have another failed state, one where Saudi Arabia has intervened with military force, where there's a cholera epidemic that's spreading, vast human suffering, and the country is further away from being an effective democracy today than it was when the United States first started meddling. Again, this just teaches us the lesson that the United States has enough trouble making democracy work here in the United States itself, trying to create it in other places that have never been democratic, and especially trying to do that with military force simply doesn't work. I think there are a set of humanitarian circumstances where the United States should think about intervening. And primarily when we think there is going to be a large-scale mass killing in the order of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And in those circumstances, we may or may not intervene, depending on, first of all, whether or not we have strategic interests that reinforce the imperative to do more, but also whether or not we are confident that intervention is actually going to make things better as opposed to making things worse. Now, an obvious case of this is Syria. There's been a horrific civil war going on in Syria now for more than 5 years. Upwards of 500,000 people have died. And many Americans have wanted the United States to get more actively involved, arming one side or the other, perhaps trying to impose some kind of no-fly zone. The difficulty is it is hard to be confident that any of those measures are actually going to make the situation better. Why? Because there are really no good guys in this particular fight, and to the extent that there are some moderate forces within the Syrian civil war, they are among the weakest and the least likely to succeed. So if the United States were to intervene, it is as likely to bring some kind of violent extremist, some kind of al-Qaeda offshoot, organizations like ISIS to power as it is to bring a bunch of nice, peace-loving, pro-American, liberal Democrats. So it would be nice to say remove the Assad regime, put him on trial for war crimes, but what we may be leaving behind would be something considerably worse. So even in the case of a clear humanitarian incentive, and those circumstances will arise from time to time, I think we want to be careful and only intervene when we know we can make it better and when we also see a way to get out so that we don't end up having to be there for decades.
Okay, what did you get out of that video? Did you agree with what Walt said? I think he did. He gave you quite a good overview, yeah, of what's happening. No views. Nothing that took you by surprise. Is this, uh, would that be, I mean, I thought there would be some information in there that you all can use, right, for DV, even for D&D, as well as SIR. Nothing. Seriously. Jin Yao, are you there? Or Gerald? Did y'all find anything useful there? Okay, I guess I'm going to be talking to myself, eh? It's about spreading of democracy. It's about state building. It's about humanitarian intervention, right? All these good stuff that y'all can probably use for D&D, for DV, for SIR. Yeah. So anyway, I think it's worthwhile going through that video because all along we've been talking about what democratic peace theory and about how the U.S. is actually trying to spread democracy because then you're less likely to have war, right? You're more likely to have peaceable what do you call it, relationships with states that are democratic, but of course um, it's not things that you would be able. I mean, it doesn't work out that way all the time, right? Yeah. And also one of the things also is that you find that the U.S. hasn't been very good at building institutions. Building strong institutions, right, in the countries that they are in because they are not really looking at helping them to build a state, right, or nation building. Yeah. So that again, another thing that would be also applicable to comparative politics because we also talk about how you need strong institutions, right, in order um, to be able to have a more stable political system, and then also to entrench a democratic culture, right? So all these are actually a lot of the stuff that he had in there that you probably can use, in DV and D&D and CP and SIR. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, yeah, I thought that was something that would be, something that would be important, and thought I'll just bring it in here, even though we have actually probably gone past some of the topics already, but still pretty relevant. Yeah. Okay, so last week we were looking at mostly elite driven, right, top down sort of influence on public opinion, right? But so today we are actually going to be looking at the bottom up theory, right, of public opinion. Basically, that public do actually can form their own opinion, right? And they and we can't always assume that they will just reflect whoever is their particular partisan politician that they trust, right? And that they will, I mean, and that the public knows relatively little about foreign affairs because there are some people who are actually keenly aware of foreign policy and foreign affairs. Yeah? So there's this widely held assumption, right, amongst politicians, amongst even some of the theorists that have been looking at or studying public opinion, right? They feel that the public knows relatively little about foreign affairs. Maybe so. I mean, if you think about the Americans in general. I mean, if we are looking at um, what unit of reference, right? Unit of analysis is America, maybe possibly, but maybe if you look at other places, like Taiwan, right? Maybe not. Yeah. So okay, so there are basically three views on public opinion of foreign policy. So the Ullman Lipman consensus has always been that um, public opinion is ill-informed, ill-structured, right? And especially they were looking at um, the situation during World War II, and they felt that the public at that point in time was ill-informed, ill-structured. Um, and of course, there's another view that sees that public opinion is actually characterized by order rather than chaos. Um, so, and now that's derived from the public's principles, values, norms, right? So basically, the public likes to see, likes to see victory, likes to see success, likes to see multilateralism, and it dislikes inconsistency. So they prefer, right, more of an order rather than a chaotic kind of situation or sentiment. Yeah. Um, there is also you know, the predictability of public opinion arising from elite influence. So there's, of course, that particular viewpoint, right? That the elites actually, because of the information asymmetry between the elites and the public, the elite is actually has an influence on shaping public opinion. And usually the public would take their cues from trusted partisan elites, and they will just passively absorb what they say, right? And they will not have their own individual viewpoint about a particular foreign policy issue, right? But Kurtzer and Zaitsev basically argue that this view of partisan elite cue taking, right, is actually overly pessimistic, right? They say that basically it's not that the public do not lack, no, that the public do not. They say that basically the public do not lack principles, and the information may not always flow from the top down, right? They could actually flow sideways as well. So basically, the authors reviewed 5 surveys of public opinion, and they found that the directionality, right, of the experiments, right, where they looked at the cause and effect, right, and in elite-driven cue-taking models, of course, they say that the cause and effect is from the elites to the public, the general public, but Kurtzer and Zaitsev basically said that it's very difficult to tell if the public was taking cues from their leaders or the strategic politicians were actually responding to their constituents' wishes, and so shaping the public policy in a particular way. Yeah, and they also found that the effects of elite partisan cues may be contextually contingent. Yeah, so in other words, right, if citizens are actually involved in discussing these public affairs, world affairs with each other, right, they may form their own understanding, right, through their social interaction, right. So if you think about social constructivist theories, right, they would construct their own understanding of what's going on, and that may eliminate the effects of elite rhetoric. And of course, there's also the evidence of disconnect between the public's wishes and the elite's preferences. So this suggests that basically we need to do more studies on the impact of social context and networking within which and the networks within which the citizens are embedded, right? Because that would be basically the meso foundations or meso theory of public opinion that has not been really explored thoroughly. Yeah, so you find that peer influence and social conformity could actually wield greater power than elite rhetoric. And this is actually becoming even more important considering the fact that we are all now connected through I mean with social media, right? A lot more you know influence is coming through our networks. Um, so Kurtzer and Zaitsev basically are suggesting that group level cues may be more potent than elite cues. So rather than elite driven cue taking models, right, being being the way that public opinion form, we need to look at the extent to which group level cues actually have influence on public opinion. You know? And also they said that if individually you have a predisposition towards international affairs, you are highly interested in international affairs, that will also weaken the impact of elite cues because you will be looking for information yourself. You will not be relying on your elites to give you the information. You'll be, especially with now the information age, you can get onto the internet very easily. You can, tap on your social networks very easily. You can hold your own right discussions right on the side, which would basically influence your own opinion about foreign affairs. Yeah. So the implications from their study is that people are perhaps more resistant to elite manipulation than suggested by the pessimistic elite-driven models of public opinion. And so basically they're saying that citizens are not entirely immune to social pressure, so it's important to study, number one, social media effects, and number two, the rally around the flag phenomenon. Okay, all right, so that's Kurtzer and Zaitsev. And then there's Gilboa as well, which I've also assigned, and I'm also going to be, I've also summarized here. Yeah. So basically, Gilboa is looking at media as a tool of foreign policy and international negotiations. So basically, they say that media does play a role in diplomacy, and that role has actually greatly expanded, especially together in tandem with the dawn of the digital age. So with technological advancements, right, allowing them to have greater mass outreach that at a cheaper and faster pace. Right, there's the accessibility of information on the internet, 24/7 news reports around the world, right? That has all actually only increased the media's role, right, and importance in diplomacy. So basically, Gilboa actually outlined three models. One is the public diplomacy model, which is where you see, that model basically is all about how state and non-state actors like NGOs and all that are using the media and other channels of communication to influence public opinion in foreign societies. So basically, for example, the US, right, the NGOs like UN and all that, using the media and other, like Radio Free Asia or whatever, right, to beam into foreign countries to try to influence the public opinion of the foreign citizens in those countries. Right. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, they're trying to beam into Eastern Europe, trying to influence the public opinion in those in Eastern Europe, for example. Then there's also the model of media diplomacy, where basically you find that officials that this model basically looks at officials using media to communicate with actors and to promote conflict resolution. So they are basically using the media as a tool to communicate with other actors, maybe the opposing state actors, to try to promote conflict resolution, possibly because they do not um, they do not have diplomatic ties, and that's how they, try to communicate, right, their intentions through the media. And then there's the media broker diplomacy, where journalists temporarily assume the role of diplomats, and then they also basically serve as mediators in international negotiations. So through possibly the interviews that they do with foreign leaders, right? They will take on a more of a role of a diplomat to basically float you know trial balloons, to try to also get a sense of um, the approach and the sentiment on the other side. you know. Okay, so public diplomacy, like we said just now, is really direct communication with foreign citizens, right? The aim is to cultivate favorable images of your state amongst the peoples abroad, the people and the governments abroad. So it's a means to increase one's soft power and also to counter the opposing state's domestic propaganda, right, with a more balanced information about yourself, about your own country, about your intentions. So this is actually achieved through cultural channels, mostly cultural, educational, and scientific exchanges. So we had talked about, for example, the Confucian institutions, right? The Confucian Institutes in the US, right? Sports, scientific exchanges, educational, exchanges, those are used to help to influence, right, the elite audiences um, that have the ability to influence public opinion. So, for example, sometimes you might have uh, officials, right, that may be sent for exchange studies, right. That is also one of the ways to try to influence the elite audiences, because those officials, right, it may be diplomatic corps officials or whatever, they are the elite audiences that will bring back the message to their home country, right? And they would also have the ability to influence public opinion. Their first-hand experience with the foreign country, they might know which the foreign country, of course, will try to make it um, as as positive as possible, right? So they will bring back that positive experience into their own country, and spread that positive vibes about that foreign country. And then you have international, and of course, international media is also one of the channels used to influence the general public. So, for example, you see, like CGTN, right, setting up, international offices all over, in international bureaus all over the world, right? BBC setting up, international bureaus around the world. You have Al Jazeera as well, right? Al Jazeera is actually a Qatar-owned, right, media organization that was initially set up to try to correct the international views of Middle East, yeah, because they found that a lot of the international media were reporting from the Western point of view. So this was to give the Middle East a voice in the international media arena. Yeah. Okay, so you have in public diplomacy, right? Gilboa actually talks about three variants within the public diplomacy model. So what he calls the basic government variant, the non-state transnational variant, and the domestic public relations variant. Okay, so in the basic government variant, you see that the government actually typically uses its own media for communication. So, for example, during the Cold War, right, the U.S. used the Voice of America, Radio Liberty, and Radio Free Europe to counter Radio Moscow. And basically, each of these states, they were trying to use that radio outlet, that the broadcast media, to shape public attitudes, right, towards the competing ideologies of democracy and communism. Then there's a non-state transnational variant, which is basically non-state actors like NGOs, UN, etc., that may play a role in shaping public opinion. So they will, like Human Rights Watch and all that, they will try to pressure the target state, right, on its human rights record, such as in China, right, Xinjiang province and all that. Then you have the domestic public relations variant, which is basically the states may actually hire international PR firms and lobbyists in the target state to help it basically, um, you know, help it craft a positive image, right? Help it to basically boost its soft power, right? And to conduct public diplomacy on its behalf. So this would, for example, they might basically direct public debate in a way so that the state officials, will discuss about that issue and may then change its foreign policy. Yeah. So the domestic PR variant actually allows the state to basically lie low, right, and not and basically to conceal its involvement. So basically, the states uh, try not to show hand, right? Don't want to show that they are actually involved in the PR drive. Um, yeah, but sometimes, of course, it may also involve the reverse goal. So it may actually direct the public debate in such a way that the state does not change its policy. So, The aim could be twofold. It could be either or, right? So the PR variant is actually quite controversial because it does raise certain ethical and professional questions, right, about whether or not you can actually a state should conceal its intentions, right, and use the PR firm in an innocuous way, right? Okay, so Gilboa basically, this is a quote that I took from Gilboa. Right? So basically, Gilboa says that it is necessary to distinguish between two fundamental different efforts to influence press accounts: public diplomacy, right, where the two sides are engaged in confrontation and primarily employ propaganda, and media diplomacy when one or both sides are ready for conflict resolution and seek negotiation and agreements. Okay, so it's very the aims are quite different, right? Public diplomacy is really, really employing propaganda um, to try to influence, right, public opinion, whereas media diplomacy is actually basically holding out the olive branch to the other side and telling the other side that you're ready to negotiate and to try to resolve conflict and to try to seek an agreement on issues that you have been in conflict over, right? Okay. Now, in terms of media diplomacy, Gilboa actually defines it as officials' uses of the media to communicate with state and non-state actors, to build confidence and advance negotiations, and to mobilize public support for agreements. So, media diplomacy is pursued through various routine and special media activities, including press conferences, interviews, and leaks, as well as visits of heads of state and mediators to rival countries, and spectacular media events organized to usher in new policy eras. Okay, so what do you think? What would be an uh, what would be an example of media diplomacy? What in recent months or years can you point to and say that that's a an example of media diplomacy? Xinjiang, is it Xinjiang? Korea, yeah. So what Trump? Okay, so in terms of Trump is with regard to which event, and then in terms of Xinjiang, which particular event would you say is a media diplomacy, and then of course the Korea as well, Qin Yao's Korea. Mm, media diplomacy necessarily mean a good thing. I mean, if you are sort of like pursuing agreements and all that, right? Um, and you're trying to advance negotiations, right? That might be seen as a good thing, isn't it? Like the first stepping stone to moving on, right? South Korea blasting music across border. Uh no, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. But okay, if you think of, let's say, let's cancel the Korea one. Okay, if you think of, let's say, Trump, right, and Kim Jong Un having holding um the talks, right, in Vietnam and Singapore, and then actually in Singapore first, then in Vietnam, then him crossing over to the North Korea, being the very first U.S. president to do so, to be on North Korean soil, etc., etc. That would be what you would see as media diplomacy, right? Because it was supposed to be, trying to get to the negotiating table, right? Showing that both sides are willing to talk and are actually willing to discuss his recent, I mean, at that point in time, recent missile um, missile tests, right? Oh, gee, yes. Yeah. So I mean, if you think about media diplomacy, you want to think about it in terms of how they use official. I mean, not say official media, but media outlets, right? You could, um, yeah, his Twitter rants doesn't really build confidence, right? If anything else, it actually wrecks uh, confidence. Yeah, it wouldn't advance negotiations also because he was actually very um, antagonistic. Yeah, yeah, he's going to be holding a news conference on Jan 6. Yeah, did you see that? I think he just announced it yesterday. For 74 million, it did build confidence. Yeah, I guess so. Another thing that you might want to think about is, the resumption of talks, right, between China and the US. Remember in Alaska, the one that we talked about phase negotiation theory, etc., etc., right? That was supposed to have been a means to actually um, establish, right, and advance their trade talks and negotiations, but it went awry. Yeah. What about? I mean, even with Iran, right? The Iran nuclear talks now, right? They are using the media to basically tell their side of the story, to basically try to um, build, right, confidence that, we are sort of advancing negotiations, but of course you see on the western side, right, I mean, um like when we talked about how, let's see, yeah, we talked about how um they may use media, right, to try to influence, right. This is public diplomacy. That one's more of propaganda. But media diplomacy is really, sometimes it's because, right, both sides do not actually talk to each other, so they use the media, right, as a form of, as a conduit, as a vehicle to basically communicate their messages. Mm. You can't believe people still use Twitter. Why not? I thought, okay, so what do you guys use now instead of Twitter? Instagram. Okay. MySpace? No. Oh, I thought MySpace was long gone. It was way before Facebook even, right? Black Lives Matter is more of a internal affair rather than a foreign policy issue. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, so Black Lives Matter would more be wouldn't be considered a foreign policy issue. I mean, when we're talking about media diplomacy in this sense, right, we're actually looking at how the media is used for diplomatic purposes, right, to affect state to state or interstate interaction, interstate decision, negotiations and agreements. Mm. Yeah, they did, but yes, they did, but it's just a sort of like offshoot. I mean, it's peripheral. They're pulling it in to basically talk about. I mean, to discredit, right, the U.S. Yeah. So uh, if you talk about media diplomacy in the sense, right, it's more like you are actually using the media for diplomatic purposes to build bridges, to build confidence, to advance negotiations, right? To get agreements for to get people to agree on something that's under negotiation, right? So yeah, this Gilboa said, right? Media diplomacy is pursued through various routine and special media activities, including press conferences, interviews, and leaks, as well as visits of heads of state and mediators to rival countries, and spectacular media events organized to usher in new policy eras. So, if you think about the signing of a ceasefire agreement, that is a press conference, that's a spectacular media event, right? If you think about in terms of Iran, right? Nuclear deal, you're seeing a lot of press conferences going on. Jake Sullivan talking about the negotiations. They are not very they're not very optimistic about a negotiation. They only have a very tight and a short timeline. I don't even know why they are putting a timeline on it, but they are actually saying that they're coming up to the deadline already. Something needs to be done, but nothing's proceeding. And then they're talking. They are also holding talks with Israel, right? So all these press conferences and all that, right? And then of course Israel side, doing interviews and then leaking out stuff. Those are also things to try to um, influence, right? The issues. tourism, tourism advertisement considered media diplomacy. Um, this is very specific to foreign policy issues. If you're talking about tourism advertisement and all that, that is what you would call um, strategies to build soft power, for example. Mm. I would see it as different now. I would see it as quite different. Um, yeah. So anyway, media diplomacy. So there are three variants of media diplomacy, right? So within media diplomacy, there's also the what Gilboa calls the basic communication variant. So basically, the media plays an important role, to convey official messages. It helps to send signals and messages to the other side, right, the opposing side, especially when you have no direct channels of communication. So you think about hostile states like the US and Iran, right? They don't have any, they refuse to have any diplomatic discussions, right? So they are actually talking to each other through the media. Yeah? So that's where press conferences and all that will come in as the basic platform for conveying official messages to the other side. So officials use media um, and even attitudes towards their journalists on the rival sites to indicate peace intentions. So if let's say they want to be nice to their side and intending to maybe extend an olive branch, they may not behave that aggressively to journalists from the other country, right? The rival side. So they may be quite nice. They may not be very aggressive to them, right? And you can see a slight change in that stance, yeah, compared to previously. Okay, then you have the traveling diplomacy variant where you have correspondents that actually accompany heads of states. So like if you think about media correspondents, right? They are on the Air Force One, right, with the U.S. President, right, with the foreign ministers, with high level officials, and then they get information. They have access to some of the information, some of the discussions done during the flight, and then they may actually use some of that, because sometimes the elites, right, like the politicians, are actually using those sort of events, right, to send signals, to float trial balloons, right? And that's where correspondents will say, according to an unnamed source, or somebody that refused to be identified, and then they'll quote somebody from talking about something about um, a possible change in stand or whatever, and that is actually a way to signal to the other side as well, right? Then you have the media events variant, which is usually planned broadcast live sessions, right? It could be like a um, public forum. It could be a press conference, right? It could be a town hall meeting, right? And it would attract the global audiences. Right? Okay, so you see like Trump Kim summit in Singapore, right? And Trump being the first U.S. president to visit North Korea, that is a media event variant. Okay, so what's the good, the bad, and the ugly of media diplomacy? So the good part about media diplomacy is that there's real time. There's a real time source of information. The bad part of it is that you have very fast diplomatic communication, and that can cause policy mistakes. Yeah. And the ugly side, of course, is that the media events may actually fail because the participants do not cooperate to make them a success. So, it turns out it backfires. So I guess if you want to look at the Alaska meeting, right, between the US and China, right, you could see that as something backfiring, because both sides didn't cooperate to. Now, initially, it was supposed to be, everybody had high hopes that they were just going to move forward from the Trump era, right, and that the the trade tensions between the US and China will ease, and things will be back to normal, whatever the normal is, right? But in the end, we saw that it actually, they had that altercation, right, on air, publicly, right? And so it was also one way for both sides to signal, right, their stand to the rest of the world, right, and to each other as well, right, to state very clearly what they were very unhappy with the other side about. Right? What was it that they were very unhappy about with the other side? Okay. All right. Then there's media broker diplomacy. Let me see. Do we want to take a break here? Because now it's about 1:15, 1:20. We can actually take a break here, because this is the third model. Or I can just go straight. Only have three more. Yeah, I only have three more PowerPoint slides. Okay, let's go straight through. Okay. Okay, so the third model is the media broker diplomacy. That's where journalists are viewed as actually playing the role of third parties, right? And basically, they are seen as formal representatives of the country of the state that they represent. So, for example, somebody from CBS or MSNBC, right? They are associated with the US. So, they are seen as a formal representative of the US, right? And so they are seen as, they play the role of the third party, and they are participants in what is viewed as a track two diplomacy, sorry. So they are viewed as unofficial mediators in informal negotiations, and they may be sort of like seen as the exploratory, right? They are seen as actually doing an exploratory pre-negotiation stage for their government. So occasionally, right, they will have an interview with, say, the diplomat from the other side, the enemy or the hostile state or the opposite side, and they try to, they use that opportunity for that interview to represent the opposite side's viewpoints, right? So they try to use, and they try to present it and project it in a more positive light to try to initiate negotiations, right? So they sometimes, the journalists may also facilitate explorations of, okay, so if this happens, right? If this, what would you like? What would you do? What are the possible um, responses, right, to resolving conflict with our government, with my government, right? So they will do hypothetical situations, right? Explore different scenarios with the diplomat that they are interviewing, right? So that those explorations of possible scenarios, different avenues to resolving conflicts are actually the exploratory pre-negotiation stages. And so their home country, right, diplomats, right, can actually watch these interviews and then have an inkling about what the other side might be open to, right, in terms of negotiations. Yeah. So this is sort of different. I mean, definitely different from media diplomacy because journalists are still pursuing their professions and they are still sort of following the. I mean, in media diplomacy, sorry, journalists are still pursuing the professions and following the lead of policymakers. So they are in media diplomacy, journalists are playing a supporting role. But with media broker diplomacy, journalists are acting more as diplomats. They are initiating and conducting critical diplomatic moves. And so they are actually catalysts for negotiations. So in terms of media broker diplomacy, journalists are actually more or less like the agenda setter. Yeah. So they are basically exploring. They probably might have might have been covering the issue for a long time. They might have their own opinion about the whole thing. They are bouncing ideas off the diplomats, right, on the other side, to see how open they are to their their suggestions, right, and maybe it might the other side might be might show that they are open to the suggestions that the journalist is providing, and then that might trigger, right, catalyze negotiations, right, on both sides, because that would allow their home country diplomats to think, okay, that is a workable solution for us as well, and we are open to talking. Okay, so there are three variants to media broker diplomacy. One is the direct intervention variant, where the journalists are actively and directly engaged in an international negotiation. There's the bridging variant, where the journalists bring the representatives from both sides, the two rival sides together, onto a program, right? So they are there together at the same time, discussing the issues that are dividing them. And so basically, the media provides the public sphere, right? Public space. They are like the public sphere, allowing for the facilitation of discussion between the two rival sides, and then they actually try to facilitate pre-negotiation, right, between the two sides, so that that would help to basically transition them into full negotiation. Yeah. Then there's also the secret variant, where sometimes veteran diplomatic correspondents from a particular media organization, who is basically very trusted by high-level officials from both sides, right, both states. They may be roped in to convey sensitive and secret information between the two sides. Yeah. So if you think about, I think it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Cuban Missile Crisis, the Russians brought in one of the correspondents. I can't remember from which media organization. Um, or rather, not the Russians, sorry, the US government actually asked one of the media correspondent, to go over to the Russians to tell them directly what they wanted, right? And then they brought back the answer from the Russian side. And of course, the Russian president also, right, issued a public statement um, to the media as well. Yeah. So that you see media broker diplomacy together with media diplomacy, right? Basically acting at the same time. Yeah. Okay, so this is basically from Gilboa, page 23, right? He put together a comparison table of the three different models of diplomacy, of public diplomacy, media diplomacy, and media broker diplomacy, right? And he basically how they differ in terms of context, the initiators for that diplomacy um, initiative, the time frame, right? The goals, the methods, etc. Yeah. So this table probably is a very good summary of the similarities and differences between the three different types of diplomacy. Yeah. The three different roles, I guess you could say, the three different models um, of the media's role in diplomacy. All right. Okay. Next up is digital diplomacy, which we'll be dealing with social media and how social media is used in diplomacy. Um, let's take a break, maybe come back around 1:45. Would that be okay? Yeah, 1:45, or if you need to stretch it further, we could actually stretch to 1:50.